At 10 o'clock at night on October 24th, 1942, Sergeant John Basilone sat in a hole filled with 6 inches of liquid mud on the island of Guadalcanal. The rain was falling so hard it felt less like weather and more like a physical punishment, hammering against his helmet and soaking the canvas belts of ammunition draped over his shoulders. Basilone wasn't looking at the rain. He was staring into the pitch-black wall of jungle to his front, a tangled mess of vines and rotting trees that smelled of sulfur and dead vegetation. Somewhere in that darkness, the Japanese 2nd Division was moving. These weren't the disorganized conscripts the Marines had fought in the early skirmishes. This was the Sendai. They were the Emperor's Hammer, a force of 3,000 battle-hardened veterans who had marched through miles of swamp with a single objective. They were going to break the Marine line, seize Henderson Field, and push every American on the island into the sea. Basilone adjusted his grip on the weapon in front of him. It was cold, slick with oil, and heavy. To the men in the rifle companies, it was a machine gun. To the engineers who designed it, it was a masterpiece of thermodynamics. But to the experts who wrote the tactical manuals, it was already a dinosaur. The weapon was the Browning M1917. It didn't look like the sleek, air-cooled guns you see in movies about Vietnam or modern wars. It looked like a piece of industrial plumbing that had been ripped out of a factory floor. It was a water-cooled heavy machine gun, a beast that weighed nearly 40 pounds just for the gun itself, plus another 50 pounds for the massive steel tripod. And that wasn't even counting the water. The barrel of the gun was encased in a thick steel jacket that held 7 pints of water. It looked like a small steam engine sitting on the mud. Connected to the jacket was a rubber hose that ran to a condensation can, designed to catch the steam when the water boiled, turn it back into liquid, and recycle it. It was a closed-loop cooling system that theoretically allowed the gun to fire forever, as long as you kept the water flowing and the ammo feeding. It was a weapon built for the static trenches of World War I, where lines didn't move and armies stared at each other for years. The experts in the rear, the men with clean uniforms and slide rules, called it the ultimate defensive instrument. They loved the math behind it. They calculated that the water jacket could keep the barrel under 212 degrees Fahrenheit, preventing the steel from softening. They wrote manuals that treated the gun like a delicate scientific instrument. They said it should be set up in a fixed position with a clear field of fire. They said it required a crew of 4 men to operate efficiently. A gunner, a loader, a spotter, and an ammo carrier. They said you should fire in disciplined bursts of 6 to 10 rounds to conserve ammunition and prevent the water from boiling too fast. The manual was very specific about the rhythm. Fire a burst, pause, check the sights. Fire a burst, pause, check the water level. It was a civilized way to kill people, based on the idea that the enemy would also be civilized. But the Marines on Guadalcanal called it the plumber's nightmare. They hated the weight. They hated the hoses that got snagged on every vine in the jungle. They hated the tripod that sank into the soft volcanic soil like a stone in a pond. When the experts said the gun was portable, they were lying. Trying to move an M1917 in the middle of a firefight was like trying to move a grand piano while someone was shooting at you. It was a 2-man job at minimum, and usually 3. If you had to run, you often had to leave the gun behind or die trying to save it. Because of this, the general consensus among the modern tacticians was that the water-cooled gun was obsolete. The war was moving fast now. It was about tanks, airplanes, and mobile infantry. A gun that needed a water tank and a condenser hose was a relic. It was a heavy, clumsy anchor that tied the Marines to a single spot on the map. They laughed at the idea of using it for anything other than long-range, indirect fire. They essentially viewed it as a small artillery piece, not an infantry weapon. Basilone didn't care about the experts. He didn't care about the weight. He was a man who understood machinery in a way that the college boys in the officer corps never could. Before the war, he had been a truck driver and a caddy. He knew that machines were only as good as the men who ran them. He had spent the last 3 days prepping his guns with an obsessive attention to detail that bordered on madness. He stripped them down in the dark, cleaning the mud out of the receivers with a toothbrush. He oiled the moving parts until they glided like they were on ice. He knew that the mud of Guadalcanal was a weapon used by the island itself. It was a gritty, abrasive paste that acted like sandpaper on steel. If a single grain of sand got into the locking mechanism of the bolt, the gun would jam. And if the gun jammed tonight, the line would break. The stakes on this particular night were absolute. The Marines were alone. The Navy had pulled the fleet back after taking heavy losses, leaving the ground troops with limited supplies and no way off the island. They were starving, surviving on wormy rice and captured Japanese rations. Half the platoon was shaking with malaria, their teeth chattering so loud you could hear it over the rain. They were rotting alive in their boots. Jungle rot had turned their feet into raw, weeping hamburger meat. They were exhausted, outnumbered, and holding a line that was stretched so thin it was practically transparent. Basilone had 2 sections of machine guns under his command, separated by about 30 yards of dense brush. It was a gap that a smart enemy could exploit, and the Sendai division was very smart. The experts had also been wrong about the terrain. They assumed that the heavy jungle would prevent the Japanese from launching a massive, coordinated assault. They thought the trees would break up the formations, forcing the enemy to attack in small groups that the riflemen could handle. They didn't understand the Japanese philosophy of war. The Japanese didn't see the jungle as an obstacle. They saw it as a cloak. They didn't care about formation. They cared about mass. They cared about the Banzai charge, a human tsunami designed to overwhelm the enemy with sheer biological weight. They weren't going to stop and shoot. They were going to run. They were going to sprint right into the face of the American fire, absorbing the bullets with their bodies so that the men behind them could get close enough to use bayonets. Against a human wave, the disciplined bursts recommended by the manual were a death sentence. If you fired 6 rounds and paused, the enemy would close the distance by 10 yards. If you paused again, they would be in your foxhole. Basilone knew that the only way to stop a charge like that was to create a solid wall of lead. He had to turn the air into a solid object, but this created a terrifying technical problem. The manual stated clearly that if you fired the gun continuously for more than a few minutes, the water would boil away. Once the water was gone, the barrel would heat up uncontrollably. Steel begins to lose its structural integrity at around 1,000 degrees. The rifling, the spiral grooves inside the barrel that spin the bullet would melt. The barrel would warp. The gun would destroy itself. The experts said it was impossible to maintain that kind of volume. They said the gun would fail. As the rain intensified, washing the camouflage paint off his face, Basilone looked at his loader. The kid looked terrified. He was clutching a box of ammunition like a life preserver. Basilone gave him a wink, a small gesture of confidence in a world that had gone crazy. He reached down and checked the water level in the jacket one last time. It was full. He checked the belt alignment. It was straight. He had done everything the manual said to do. He had positioned the gun with grazing fire angles. He had cleared the fields of fire. He had set up the interlocking zones. By every metric of military science, he was prepared, but deep down, he knew that science was about to leave the building. The first sign of the attack wasn't a sound, it was a smell. The wind shifted, blowing from the jungle toward the marine lines. It carried the heavy, sweet scent of chili powder and sweat. The Japanese soldiers had eaten a final meal of spicy rice before the attack. Then came the noise. It started as a low murmur, like the ocean coming in, and then it swelled into a roar. Thousands of voices chanting in unison. Banzai, Banzai. It was a sound that bypassed the logical brain and went straight to the primitive stem. It was the sound of inevitable death. A flare popped overhead, bathing the ridge in a flickering, sickly green light, and there they were. The jungle floor was moving. It looked like a carpet of brown uniforms was rolling up the hill. They were shoulder to shoulder, bayonets fixed, screaming. There were no tactics here. There was no cover and fire. There was just a sprint. The experts had laughed at the plumber's nightmare because it was too heavy to move. They laughed at the water tank. They laughed at the hoses. But as Basilone racked the charging handle and felt the heavy bolt slam home, he knew that the weight was the only thing that was going to save them. The heavy tripod dug into the mud, anchoring the weapon against the earth. The water in the jacket sloshed, cool and ready. The manual said to fire in bursts. The manual said to conserve ammunition. The manual said to watch the temperature gauges. Basilone looked at the wave of men rushing toward him, 10 deep, their faces twisted in fury. He squeezed the trigger, and he decided right then and there that he wasn't going to let go until the belt was empty or the gun melted into a pile of slag. The experts had built a machine, but they had forgotten to account for the man who was holding it. The battle for Henderson Field didn't start with a maneuver, it started with a collision. The wave of Japanese infantry hit the marine line like a freight train hitting a wall of sandbags. In the first 30 seconds, the concept of controlled fire evaporated. Basilone clamped his thumbs down on the butterfly trigger of the Browning, and the gun began to vibrate with a violence that shook his entire upper body. The belt of ammunition, which usually fed into the receiver with a rhythmic click-clack, turned into a blur of brass and cloth. The heavy water-cooled gun roared, sending a stream of copper-jacketed slugs into the darkness at 500 rounds per minute. The impact of the rounds on the charging mass was gruesome and immediate. The .30 caliber bullets didn't just stop the attackers, they threw them backward. The energy transfer at close range was enough to lift a man off his feet. But for every man that fell, 2 more stepped over his body. They were climbing over the dead to get to the living. The plumber's nightmare, was now doing exactly what the engineers had designed it to do, but it was doing it at a pace that was terrifying to watch. The water inside the heavy steel jacket around the barrel began to boil within the first minute of sustained fire. The physics of thermodynamics were working overtime. The friction of the bullets tearing down the barrel generated immense heat, transferring it into the 7 pints of water. The water turned to steam, which hissed angrily out of the relief valve and traveled down the rubber hose into the condensation can. It looked like a science experiment gone wrong. A plume of white steam rose from the gun pit, mixing with the rain and the cordite smoke. To the Japanese, it was a beacon. They saw the steam, they saw the muzzle flash, and they knew exactly where the death was coming from. They focused everything they had on that pit. Grenades landed in the mud, throwing geysers of black sludge into the air. Bullets pinged off the water jacket, sounding like a hammer hitting an anvil. Basilone ignored the incoming fire. He was locked in a private struggle with his machine. The manual said that a water-cooled gun could fire indefinitely, but that was a lie told by men who had never fought in a jungle. The mud was the real enemy. As the belt whipped out of the ammo box, it dragged across the wet ground, picking up grit and volcanic sand. That grit was carried into the receiver, right into the delicate, machined steel guts of the weapon. It acted like grinding paste. The gun began to stutter. The smooth, hydraulic rhythm turned into a jagged, coughing chop. Basilone knew the sound. It was the sound of a jam waiting to happen. He screamed at his loader to keep the belt high, to keep it out of the filth, but the loader was busy trying to keep his head attached to his shoulders. The mud was everywhere. It coated their hands, their faces, and the ammunition. It was a battle between American steel and Guadalcanal dirt, and the dirt was winning. Then, the inevitable happened. The gun on Basilone's right flank, manned by a kid who had barely finished boot camp, went silent. It wasn't out of ammo. It had jammed, the sand had worked its way into the locking lugs, and the bolt was frozen shut. The silence from that position was deafening. It created a dead zone, a 30-yard gap in the wall of lead. The Japanese sensed it instantly. They didn't need a radio. They flowed like water toward the path of least resistance. They poured into the gap, screaming, sensing the weakness. If they got through, they would flank Basilone's position and roll up the entire line from behind. The defense would collapse like a house of cards. Basilone saw the breach. He saw the Japanese soldiers sprinting through the dark, bypassing his field of fire. He knew he couldn't traverse his heavy gun far enough to the right to catch them. The tripod was dug too deep into the mud. The geometry was wrong. This was the moment where the manual said to fall back. It said to disable the weapon, retreat to a secondary line, and regroup. It said that a machine gunner without a field of fire is a dead man. Basilone decided to rewrite the manual. He didn't retreat. He grabbed the scorching hot handle of his gun and disconnected it from the tripod. The M1917 weighed roughly 40 pounds without the mount. It was a heavy, awkward lump of steel with a boiling tank of water on the front. It wasn't designed to be carried. It wasn't designed to be fired from the hip. But Basilone didn't have time to be an engineer. He lifted the gun, the steam hose dangling like a severed artery, and he ran. He splashed through the knee-deep mud, moving toward the silent gun pit on the right. He wasn't running away from the enemy. He was running parallel to them, exposing his entire body to the fire to get to the breakdown. He slid into the silent pit, crashing into the mud next to the terrified crew who were frantically trying to clear the jam. He didn't bother with their gun. He slammed his own weapon onto the edge of the foxhole. He didn't have time to set up a tripod. He didn't have time to level the legs or adjust the traversing and elevating mechanism. He just used the earth itself. He slammed the bottom of the receiver into the mud bank and pulled the trigger. The gun roared back to life, spitting flame into the flank of the Japanese charge. The recoil was brutal. Without the heavy tripod to absorb the shock, the gun kicked like a mule, driving the stock into Basilone's shoulder with bruising force. He had to wrestle it, fighting the muzzle climb, forcing the barrel down to keep the bullets at waist height. He was using his own body as the mount. He was the meat tripod, absorbing the violence of the explosion so that the bullets would go where they needed to go. The Japanese who had rushed into the gap were caught in the open. They had expected a clear run. Instead, they ran face first into a new stream of fire that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Basilone swept the gun back and forth, hosing the area. The steam from the water jacket was hissing right next to his ear, hot and loud. The barrel was getting hotter. The water was boiling off faster now because the hose was disconnected, and the steam had nowhere to go but out into the night air. The metal of the water jacket, which was supposed to stay cool, began to radiate heat like a wood stove. Basilone could feel it through his shirt. He could feel the heat baking the skin on his left arm, which was wrapped around the jacket to hold the gun steady. It was a searing, radiant pain, but it was a distant problem. The immediate problem was the 1,000 men trying to kill him, but the MacGyver solution came with a price. By moving the gun and firing it without the cooling system intact, he was pushing the weapon past its breaking point. And worse, he was running out of ammo. The belt snapped empty, the tail end whipping into the receiver. He screamed for another belt. The loader in the pit looked at him with wide, panicked eyes and shook his head. They were dry. The gun crew he had just saved had used all their ammo before the jam. Basilone's own supply was back in his original position, 40 yards away through a gauntlet of enemy fire. The gun was useless without the belts. It was just a heavy club. Most men would have pinned themselves to the bottom of the hole and prayed for dawn. Basilone looked at the jungle, looked at his pistol, and made a choice that bordered on insanity. He drew his Colt .45 pistol. It looked tiny and pathetic compared to the machine gun. He grabbed his machete in the other hand. He told the survivors in the hole to fix the jammed gun or die trying, and then he climbed out of the foxhole. He ran back into the darkness, heading toward the rear supply lines. The jungle was crawling with Japanese infiltrators. They were everywhere in the trees, in the grass, behind the logs. Basilone ran a gauntlet of shadows. He wasn't sneaking, he was charging. He ran into a group of Japanese soldiers who had slipped through the wire. They were setting up a mortar. Basilone didn't stop to aim. He fired the pistol at point-blank range, the heavy slugs dropping men in their tracks. When the pistol ran dry, he swung the machete. It was primal, ugly, close-quarters butchery. He carved a path through the enemy, driven by a singular, frantic need. He had to get bullets for the big gun. He reached the supply dump, chest heaving, his uniform torn and covered in slime. The supply clerks looked at him like he was a ghost. He didn't ask for permission. He grabbed 2 massive boxes of belted ammunition, slinging them over his shoulders like saddlebags, 80 pounds of lead and brass. Then he turned around and ran back the way he came. He ran back through the kill zone. He ran back through the mortar fire. He ran back to the line that was crumbling by the second. When he dove back into the gun pit, the Marines looked at him with something resembling religious awe. He wasn't just a sergeant anymore. He was the god of logistics. He slammed the fresh belt into the gun, racked the slide, and the roar began again. But now the gun was changing. The water was gone. The jacket was empty. The cooling system had failed completely. The experts said that without water, the M1917 would fail in 2 minutes. They said the barrel would warp and the gun would seize. Basilone didn't care about the experts. He cared about the fact that the enemy was now 20 feet away. He clamped his hand onto the grip. He wrapped his other hand, protected only by a rag, around the scorching metal of the barrel jacket. He ignored the physics. He ignored the metallurgy. He held the trigger down. The gun began to sing a different song now. It wasn't the rhythmic chug-chug of a well-oiled machine. It was a high-pitched, metallic scream. The steel was expanding. The grease was cooking off, creating a cloud of acrid smoke that stung his eyes. The barrel was turning from a dull gray to a faint, glowing red. The heat was incredible. It radiated through the receiver group, heating the steel handles of the gun until they were hot enough to blister skin. Basilone's hands were burning. The pain was sharp and immediate, the smell of singed hair and cooking flesh mixing with the gunpowder. But he didn't let go. He couldn't let go. If he stopped firing to cool the gun, the Japanese would overrun the hole in 10 seconds. He had to make a trade. He had to trade the skin on his hands and the life of the gun for the lives of his men. He squeezed harder. The barrel turned a brighter red, glowing like a cigarette cherry in the dark. The bullets were still coming out, but the gun was dying. It was eating itself alive to keep firing. The Japanese saw the glowing gun. It was a beacon of defiance. They charged it, screaming, throwing themselves at the muzzle. Basilone traversed the weapon, sweeping the fire across the line. The red-hot barrel hissed as raindrops hit it, evaporating instantly. He was firing a weapon that was physically melting in his hands. The manual said this was impossible. The manual said the gun would jam, but the gun kept working, driven by the sheer force of will of the man holding it. He was forcing the mechanism to cycle through the heat, racking it violently when it hesitated, clearing stoppages with a smashed hand, and getting it back into the fight. He was entering the territory of legend, where the machine stops being a collection of parts and becomes an extension of the soldier's rage. The escalation was complete. The technical war was over. The primitive war had begun. As the night dragged on toward 3 in the morning, the battle shifted from a tactical engagement into a physics experiment gone horribly wrong. The M1917 machine gun in Sergeant Basilone's hands was no longer a precision instrument. It was a dying star. The cooling system was a distant memory. The water jacket, designed to hold liquid at a manageable temperature, was now empty, acting as a reverberating oven around the barrel. The steel of the barrel itself had passed the cherry red stage and was approaching a blinding white-hot incandescence. In the world of metallurgy, this is the point of no return. The crystalline structure of the metal was breaking down. The steel was becoming plastic, soft and malleable. Under normal circumstances, a gunner would swap the barrel. But you can't swap a barrel when there are 300 men screaming for your blood 10 yards away. You just keep shooting until the physics give up. This heat created a ballistic phenomenon that the manual never mentioned, but one that turned out to be horrifyingly effective. Inside a normal barrel, there is rifling, spiral grooves cut into the steel that grab the bullet and spin it. This spin is what makes the bullet fly straight, like a perfectly thrown football. It cuts through the air with aerodynamic grace. But as the barrel of Basilone's gun began to melt, the rifling was stripped away. The grooves were ironed out by the friction and the heat. The gun effectively became a smoothbore musket. The bullets stopped spinning. Instead of flying like footballs, they began to tumble like bricks thrown out of a moving car. They wobbled, flipped, and cartwheeled through the air. At long range, a tumbling bullet is useless. It flies off in random directions. But at point-blank range, the knife-fighting distance of the Guadalcanal jungle, a tumbling bullet is a monster. When a spinning bullet hits a man, it drills a neat, clean hole. When a tumbling bullet hits a man, it strikes sideways. It doesn't puncture, it smashes. The impact creates a wound channel the size of a fist. It tears muscle and bone apart with kinetic violence that looks more like an explosion than a gunshot. The Japanese soldiers charging Basilone's position weren't just being shot. They were being physically disassembled by erratic chunks of lead that were hitting them broadside. The keyhole wounds named for the shape the bullet makes when it hits sideways were gruesome. The gun was destroying itself, but in its death throes, it was inflicting more damage than it ever had when it was working perfectly. Basilone was now fighting the weapon as much as he was fighting the enemy. The heat radiating from the receiver was intense enough to cook meat. The grease and oil that kept the internal parts moving had long since boiled off, leaving dry metal grinding against dry metal. The gun began to seize, the cycle of the bolt slowing down, fighting the friction. Basilone had to muscle the weapon, racking the charging handle with violent, jerking motions to force the next round into the chamber. Every time he touched the metal, it burned him. He didn't have the asbestos mittens that the heavy weapons crews were supposed to carry. He had his bare hands and maybe a rag that was already smoldering. His skin was blistering, the flesh turning raw and red, but the adrenaline dumping into his system acted as a chemical wall against the pain. He was operating in a fugue state, a place where the conscious mind shuts down and the reptilian brain takes over. He wasn't thinking about his hands, he was thinking about the rate of fire. The sheer volume of bodies piling up in front of the gun became a tactical problem. This is something you don't see in movies. In a real human wave attack, the dead don't vanish. They stack. The Japanese were pressing the attack with such suicidal ferocity that the corpses were forming a physical wall in front of the Marine position. The mound of bodies grew 2 feet high, then 3. It began to block Basilone's field of fire. He couldn't shoot the men in the back of the wave because the men in the front were already dead and in the way. He had to stand up, exposing his upper body to the swarm of bullets, just to get the muzzle of the gun over the rampart of flesh. He was firing down into the next wave. The tracers were sparking off the helmets of the fallen, ricocheting wildly into the trees. It was a scene from a nightmare, a landscape built entirely of mud and death. Then the ammunition ran dry again. The belt snapped empty. The click of the firing pin hitting empty air was felt more than heard. The silence that rushed into the vacuum was terrifying. The Japanese heard it too. A scream went up from the jungle, a renewed cry of Banzai, as they realized the dragon had stopped breathing fire. They surged forward, clambering over the wall of their own dead, bayonets glinting in the flare light. They were 5 yards away, 3 yards. Basilone didn't have time to run for ammo this time. He didn't have time to fix the gun. The machine was done. It was time for the man to take over. He dropped the useless, glowing lump of steel and grabbed the machete he had used earlier. He pulled his Colt 45 from his holster. He stepped out of the foxhole to meet them. This wasn't a firefight anymore. It was a brawl. A Japanese officer charged him, swinging a samurai sword, a katana made of folded steel that could shear through a rifle barrel. Basilone stepped inside the swing, the air whooshing past his ear. He fired the pistol point blank, the heavy .45 caliber slug knocking the officer backward into the mud. Another soldier lunged with a bayonet. Basilone parried it with the machete, the metal clanging loudly, and swung back with a backhand blow. It was ugly, desperate work. It was punching, kicking, and stabbing in the dark, slipping on the blood-slicked mud, fighting for inches of ground. For a few minutes, Basilone was a one-man army holding the center of the line with nothing but hand weapons. But he knew he couldn't hold them off forever with a pistol. He needed the machine gun. He needed the rhythm. He kicked a Japanese soldier away and dove back into the pit. He grabbed the machine gun again. He fumbled in the dark mud at the bottom of the hole, his burned fingers searching desperately for a loose belt, a partial strip, anything that had bullets in it. He found a fragment of a belt, maybe 20 rounds that had been dropped in the chaos. He shook the mud off it. He popped the top cover of the gun. The metal sizzled where his sweat hit it. He slammed the belt in. He racked the bolt. The gun fired. Those 20 rounds bought him 10 seconds. But those 10 seconds were enough for the reinforcements to arrive. A few Marines from the rear echelon, cooks, clerks, runners who had grabbed rifles, slid into the mud beside him. They didn't have machine guns, but they had rifles and grenades. They started throwing grenades over the wall of bodies, the explosions flashing white and orange, blowing gaps in the attacking force. Basilone used the respite to send a runner for more ammo. "Don't come back without it," he screamed, his voice raw and cracking from the smoke. The runner scrambled away. Basilone went back to working the gun. He found that if he kicked the bolt forward with his boot, he could force it to close on the warped cartridges. He was physically beating the weapon into submission, forcing it to kill. The heat of the battle had destroyed the concept of time. It could have been minutes or hours. It all felt like one long, continuous scream. The barrel was glowing cherry red, so hot the steel began to soften. Gravity pulled the unsupported muzzle downward, creating an accidental, but deadly, advantage. The droop forced the bullets into the ground just 10 feet ahead. The bullets were hitting the ground 10 feet in front of the gun, skipping up into the enemy. It was ricochet fire by accident. The rounds were striking the volcanic rock and shattering, sending showers of stone shrapnel into the legs of the attackers. It was a crude shotgun effect. The gun was no longer a precise tool of war. It was a bludgeon that spewed hot lead. Around 4 in the morning, the attacks began to change. The Sendai division was breaking. They had thrown their best men at the plumber's nightmare, and the nightmare had won. The human wave had crashed against the rock of Basilone's position and shattered. The organized charges turned into sporadic, suicidal rushes by small groups of men who knew they were already dead. They weren't trying to take the airfield anymore. They were just trying to die with honor. Basilone obliged them. He was sitting in a pile of brass casings that came up to his waist. The level of the spent shells was so high that he had to dig his feet in to find purchase. The condensation can for the water jacket had been shot to pieces hours ago. The hose was shredded. The gun was a wreck, but Basilone kept squeezing. He looked down at his hands during a brief lull in the firing. In the flashing light of the mortars, they looked like foreign objects. They were black with carbon, red with blood, and covered in blisters that had popped and filled with mud. He couldn't straighten his fingers. They were clawed into the shape of the pistol grip. The muscles in his forearms were cramped solid, locked in a spasm of tension. He realized he probably wouldn't be able to hold a fork or button a shirt for weeks. But as he looked up and saw another shadow moving in the wire, the pain didn't matter. He racked the bolt again. The sound was sluggish, a metal-on-metal grind that sounded like a car engine with no oil. The gun fired. The shadow fell. The psychological impact on the Japanese survivors was absolute. They had been told that the Americans were soft. They had been told that the Marines would run when faced with the spirit of the warrior. But they had run into a demon. They had run into a man who stood in the open, hugged a burning piece of steel, and refused to die. The Banzai spirit had met the can-do spirit, and the Banzai had blinked. The noise of the battle began to fade, replaced by the moans of the wounded and the hiss of the rain hitting the hot guns. The darkness to the east began to turn a bruised purple. The night was ending. Basilone leaned his forehead against the back plate of the gun. He was shaking uncontrollably now, the adrenaline crash hitting him like a physical blow. He tried to let go of the handles, but his hands wouldn't open. The skin had literally fused to the parkerized steel in a few places. He had to peel himself off the weapon. He looked at the barrel. It was a ruin. It was white and flaky, the metal oxidized and destroyed. The rifling was gone. The water jacket was dented and pierced in a dozen places. It would never fire again. It was scrap metal. But as the first gray light of dawn started to filter through the trees, revealing the carnage in front of the hole, Basilone knew it was the most beautiful piece of junk he had ever seen. The line had held, the airfield was safe, and the experts who said the gun was too heavy to save a mobile defense were about to wake up to a world where they were wrong. The sun that rose over Guadalcanal on the morning of October 25, 1942, did not look like a symbol of hope. It looked like a spotlight turning on in a slaughterhouse. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the air thick with steam and the sickening, sweet smell of death. The silence on the ridge was absolute. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a morning in the country. It was the stunned, ringing silence that follows a catastrophe. Sergeant John Basilone sat in the mud at the bottom of his foxhole, staring at his boots. His hands were shaking so bad he couldn't have lit a cigarette if he wanted to. They were wrapped in dirty rags, throbbing with a pulse that felt like a hammer hitting his fingertips. He was covered in a layer of black carbon, oil, and blood that had baked into his skin like a second hide. He looked less like a human being and more like a statue made of volcanic ash. When the officers from the rear finally made their way up the slippery ridge to inspect the lines, they stopped walking about 20 yards from Basilone's position. They stopped because they couldn't go any further. The ground in front of the machine gun nest was impassable. It wasn't blocked by wire or logs, it was blocked by the Sendai division. The bodies of the Japanese soldiers were piled 3 and 4 deep. They were stacked like cordwood, a gruesome rampart of human wreckage that stretched for nearly 100 yards. The experts who had claimed that the heavy water-cooled gun was a defensive relic, a tool for static warfare that couldn't stop a mobile assault, stood there with their mouths open. They were looking at the physical evidence of a single man with a single machine holding back a tidal wave. The officers picked their way through the carnage, stepping over the debris of the attack. They found the machine gun. It was unrecognizable. The barrel jacket, which had started the night as a smooth, green steel cylinder, was now a warped, blackened husk. It looked like it had been pulled out of a house fire. The paint had blistered and peeled away in large flakes. The metal had oxidized to a chalky white. The receiver group was jammed solid, fused together by the heat and the lack of lubrication. It was a dead piece of iron, but around it the story of the night was written in brass. The floor of the foxhole was carpeted in thousands of empty shell casings. They were piled so high that they spilled over the lip of the hole and cascaded down the hill like a metallic waterfall, and not just in one spot. The officers found piles of brass in the primary pit, piles in the secondary pit, and piles in the fallback position. They realized that Basilone hadn't just fired the gun. He had moved a 90-pound anchor around the battlefield like it was a rifle, fighting a mobile war with a static weapon. The vindication was total. The plumber's nightmare had worked, not because the manual was right, but because the man operating it had ignored the manual completely. He had treated the gun like a consumable resource. He had spent the life of the machine to buy the lives of his platoon. The medics arrived to look at Basilone's hands. When they peeled the rags away, the skin was raw, blistered, and angry. He had second and degree burns across his palms and the insides of his forearms. He had literally cooked his own flesh against the steel jacket to keep the gun steady. It was a handshake with hell that had saved the line. The medics bandaged him up, telling him he would be out of action for weeks. Basilone just looked at the destroyed gun and asked if they had any spare barrels. The Marine Corps didn't let him fade into obscurity. They realized they had a legend on their hands. They pulled him off the line. They gave him the Medal of Honor, the highest award the country could give. But then, they did something that Basilone hated more than the Japanese army. They turned him into a celebrity. They sent him back to the United States to sell war bonds. They put him in a clean uniform, polished his shoes, and paraded him around ballrooms and theaters. They wanted him to smile and wave and tell the folks back home that everything was going fine. For a guy who had just hugged a burning machine gun in the mud, this was torture. He felt like a zoo animal. He felt like a fraud. Every time people clapped for him, he thought about the guys he had left behind in the jungle, the guys who were still rotting in the rain while he was eating steak dinners in New York. The hero trap is a dangerous place for a soldier. The experts and the politicians wanted Basilone to be a safe, comfortable symbol of American strength. They wanted him to stay home, marry a movie star, and be the face on a poster. But Basilone wasn't built for posters. He was a machine gunner. He missed the weight of the tripod. He missed the smell of the oil. He missed the honesty of the line, where the only thing that mattered was whether your gun worked and your buddy was alive. He started petitioning the Marine Corps to let him go back. The generals said no. They said he was too valuable as a recruitment tool. They said he had done his bit, but Basilone didn't take no for an answer. He pestered them, he argued with them, and he finally told them that he was going back to the war whether they gave him orders or not. He got his wish. In 1945, Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone landed on the black sands of Iwo Jima. The war had changed since Guadalcanal. The weapons were newer. The tanks were bigger. The enemy was dug into caves and tunnels, not charging in open waves, but the job was the same. Basilone led his machine gun section off the beach, pushing inland against the heaviest fire of the Pacific War. He wasn't carrying a water-cooled M1917 this time. He was carrying a lighter, air-cooled machine gun. But the spirit was the same. He was aggressive. He was loud. He was walking into the fire, guiding a tank through a minefield, destroying blockhouses, doing the work of 10 men. He didn't survive Iwo Jima. A Japanese mortar round landed squarely in his group, killing him instantly. He died the way he had lived, moving toward the enemy, ignoring the odds and leading from the front. When the news of his death reached the United States, it was a shock. The Bond tour hero was gone, but to the men in the machine gun squads, it made perfect sense. Basilone was never going to die in a bed. He was a creature of the line. His legacy wasn't the medal around his neck or the statues they built in his hometown. His legacy was the lesson he taught the Marine Corps on that rainy night in Guadalcanal. He taught them that technology is always secondary to will. He taught them that a weapon is only obsolete if you lack the courage to use it. He proved that you can take a heavy, clumsy, broken piece of junk and turn it into the hammer of God if you are willing to pay the price in pain. The M1917 machine gun was eventually retired. It was replaced by the M60 and later the M240 lighter guns with quick-change barrels and better ergonomics. The days of water jackets and condensation hoses are long gone. You won't see a plumber's nightmare on a modern battlefield, but if you look closely at the training of a modern machine gunner, you will see the ghost of John Basilone. When they teach a young Marine to clear a jam in 3 seconds, they are teaching him the Basilone way. When they teach him to traverse and search, to cover his sector even when the world is ending, they are channeling the spirit of the Ridge. Don't just see Basilone as a black and white photo of a guy smiling with a medal. Remember the mud. Remember the smell of burning skin. Remember the moment a man looked at a failing machine and decided to become the machine himself. In the end, wars aren't won by the weapons with the best specs on paper. Wars aren't won by the weapons with the best specs on paper. They are won by the people who refuse to let go of the trigger. So the next time you hear someone complain that their equipment isn't good enough or that the conditions aren't perfect, remember the man who hugged the burning iron. Remember the steam rising in the rain. And remember that the only thing that stops a Marine machine gunner is the end of the belt or the end of his life. We are committed to digging these stories out of the archives and putting them back in the front line where they belong. If you want to help us keep the history alive, you know the drill. Smash that like button like it's a jammed bolt carrier. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dive into the moments that defined a generation. And tell us in the comments, what is another story of a soldier who pushed his equipment past the breaking point to save his friends? We read every single one. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping us honor the memory of Manila John Basilone. Stay safe and check your headspace and timing.